The diplomatic shuttle broke through the thick amber clouds of Venomous 7 and began its slow descent toward the surface. Inside the vessel, Ambassador Diane Crawford sat near the viewport with a tablet in her hands. She was reviewing everything she knew about the Thalorians, the ancient alien species that had finally agreed to meet with humanity after decades of careful observation from afar. Beside her sat Lieutenant Kyle Bishop, a security officer, who was checking his equipment for what seemed like the 100th time since they had left Earth. Behind them sat the rest of the delegation. There were scientists, translators, cultural advisors, and one junior xenobiologist named Kevin Harper. Kevin was only 28 years old, which made him the youngest member of the team by at least a decade. He had been chosen for this mission because of his work with dangerous animals on several colony worlds. He had a gift for understanding creatures that others feared, and his superiors thought that gift might prove useful on a world known throughout the galaxy for its deadly wildlife. Kevin was not paying attention to the briefing materials on his own tablet. Instead, he was staring out the small window at the alien world below. The surface of Venomous 7 was covered in vast forests that glowed with soft bioluminescent light. The trees were not green like the trees of Earth. They were crystalline structures that caught the light and scattered it in rainbow patterns across the landscape. Rivers of silver liquid wound between the forests, and in the distance, Kevin could see the spires of the Thalorian capital city rising from the ground like organic sculptures. The pilot announced that they would be landing in 5 minutes. Ambassador Crawford put away her tablet and smoothed the front of her formal uniform. She was a tall woman in her early 50s, with silver hair cut short and practical. She had spent her entire career preparing for moments like this one. First contact with a new species was rare, and peaceful first contact was even rarer. The Thalorians had been watching humanity for a long time, and they had finally decided that humans were worth talking to. The shuttle touched down on a landing platform, made of some smooth white material that seemed to glow faintly from within. Through the viewport, Kevin could see a delegation of Thalorians waiting to receive them. The aliens were tall and slender, standing nearly 7 feet in height. Their skin was a pale lavender color, and their faces were elongated with large eyes that seemed to shift between gold and silver depending on the light. They wore robes of deep violet that flowed around their thin frames like water. Ambassador Crawford stood and addressed her team. She reminded them that they were representing all of humanity in this moment. She told them to be respectful, to be careful, and above all, to listen more than they spoke. The Thalorians had been building civilizations when humans were still living in caves. They had much to teach, and humanity had much to learn. The shuttle door opened, and warm air rushed inside. It smelled sweet and strange, like honey mixed with something Kevin could not identify. The delegation walked down the ramp in a careful line, with Ambassador Crawford at the front and Kyle Bishop close behind her. Kevin brought up the rear, his eyes moving constantly as he took in every detail of this new world. The leader of the Thalorian delegation stepped forward. He was older than the others, with deep lines carved into his lavender face, and eyes that held the weight of centuries. He introduced himself as High Counselor Vetheran, and he raised his 4-fingered hands in a gesture of welcome. Ambassador Crawford returned the greeting in the traditional Thalorian manner, which she had practiced for months. Vetheran seemed pleased by her effort, and a small smile crossed his alien features. But then his expression grew serious. He told the ambassador that there were dangers on Venomous 7 that humans needed to understand. The planet was home to many species that could kill with a single touch. The forests were beautiful, but they were also deadly. And the most dangerous creatures of all were the ones called venomous gliders. Kevin felt his attention sharpen at the mention of the gliders. He had read about them during the journey from Earth. They were flying creatures about the size of house cats, with membrane wings and scales that shimmered with impossible colors. Their bodies produced a toxin so powerful that it could kill most carbon-based life forms in minutes. Even the Thalorians, who had evolved on this world, were not immune to their poison. Vetheran continued his warning. He said that the gliders were sacred to his people, but they were also feared above all other creatures. In 40,000 years of recorded history, only 6 Thalorians had ever survived contact with a glider, and all of them had suffered permanent damage to their minds. The toxin did not just kill. It destroyed everything that made a person who they were. He looked directly at Ambassador Crawford as he spoke. He told her that her people must never approach the gliders. They must never try to touch them or interact with them in any way. The creatures were beautiful, but that beauty was a trap. Their scales secreted venom constantly, and even the slightest brush of skin against their bodies would trigger a fatal reaction. Ambassador Crawford nodded solemnly. She promised that her team would follow all safety protocols. She had no intention of losing anyone on this mission, especially not to something that could be avoided with simple caution. Kevin listened to the exchange, but his mind was elsewhere. He was looking past the delegation toward the edge of the forest that bordered the landing platform. Among the crystalline trees, he could see movement. Something was gliding between the branches, its scales catching the light and throwing off sparks of color that seemed to dance in the air. A venomous glider. His first glimpse of the creature that everyone on this world feared more than death itself, thought it was beautiful. More beautiful than anything Kevin had ever seen in his years of studying alien wildlife. And as he watched it disappear into the depths of the forest, he felt something stir inside him. It was not fear. It was curiosity. It was wonder. And it was something else that he could not quite name. The delegation was led away from the landing platform toward a series of organic buildings that seemed to grow directly from the ground. Kevin followed along with the others, but he kept glancing back toward the forest. The glider was gone now, hidden somewhere in those glowing crystalline trees, but Kevin knew he would see it again. He did not know how he knew this, but he was certain of it. There was something about those creatures that called to him, something that made him want to understand them in a way that no one on this world ever had. The warning echoed in his mind as he walked. Never touch a venomous glider. Never approach them. Never even get close. Kevin had spent his entire life being told what he could not do. He had been told that he could not work with venomous snakes, but he had done it anyway. He had been told that he could not calm a wounded predator on Kepler 442b, but he had done that too. Every time someone told him that something was impossible, he found a way to prove them wrong. He did not know it yet, but he was about to do it again. The first 3 days on Velarus 7 passed in a blur of formal meetings and diplomatic ceremonies. Ambassador Crawford spent most of her time in the Grand Council chambers, negotiating trade agreements and cultural exchange programs with High Counselor Vetheran and his advisors. The talks were going well. The Thalorians seemed genuinely interested in building a relationship with humanity, and Crawford was careful to move slowly and respectfully through each stage of the process. Kevin had very little to do with the negotiations. His role was to document the local wildlife and provide reports on any species that might pose a threat to future human visitors. It was important work, but it also gave him plenty of time to explore the world around him. He was assigned a Thalorian guide named Silvera, a young scientist who specialized in the study of dangerous fauna. Silvera was fascinated by humans. She had never met one before, and she asked Kevin endless questions about Earth and its creatures. She wanted to know about the animals that humans kept as pets. She wanted to know about the predators that humans had learned to avoid. And she wanted to know why humans seemed so fearless in the face of danger. Kevin told her that humans were not fearless at all. They were just stubborn. When something scared them, they did not run away from it. They studied it until they understood it, and then they found a way to live alongside it. It was how humans had survived on a planet full of creatures that could kill them. It was how they had spread across the stars to colonize worlds that should have been impossible to tame. Silvera listened to his words with great interest. She said that her people had a different approach. When something was dangerous, they avoided it completely. They built walls around it and created laws to keep their people safe. It had worked for 40,000 years, and they saw no reason to change. On the fourth day, Silvera took Kevin to see the Gardens of Eternal Warning. It was a vast park in the center of the capital city, filled with monuments to all the Thalorians who had died from contact with dangerous wildlife. There were thousands of monuments stretching back through the ages. Each one told a story of tragedy and loss. The largest section of the garden was dedicated to the victims of the Venomous gliders. There were more monuments here than anywhere else. Silvera walked among them with her head bowed, and Kevin could see the weight of grief in her posture. She told him that almost everyone on Velarus 7 had lost someone to the gliders. It was a shared trauma that bound her people together across generations. Kevin asked her to tell him more about the creatures. He wanted to understand everything about them. How they lived, how they hunted, how they raised their young. He wanted to know why they were so deadly and whether there was any way to predict their attacks. Silver was surprised by his questions. Most visitors wanted to know how to avoid the gliders, not how to understand them. But she could see that Kevin was sincere in his curiosity, so she told him everything she knew. The venomous gliders lived in colonies high in the crystalline canopy. They were social creatures that formed strong bonds with their family groups. They communicated through a complex system of sounds and color changes in their scales. They ate small insects and drank nectar from the bioluminescent flowers that grew throughout the forest. They were not aggressive by nature. In fact, they were quite shy. They avoided contact with larger creatures whenever possible and only attacked when they felt threatened. The problem was that their definition of threatened was very broad. Any warm-blooded creature that came within touching distance triggered their defensive response. Their scales would flood with venom, and even the slightest contact would be fatal. Kevin listened carefully to everything Silvera told him. He asked about the venom itself. He wanted to know how it worked and whether there was any antidote. Silvera shook her head sadly. The venom was a complex cocktail of neurotoxins that attacked the nervous system with terrifying speed. By the time symptoms appeared, it was already too late. The victim would experience paralysis, then seizures, then death. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. There was no antidote. Thalorian scientists had been trying to develop one for thousands of years, but the venom was too complex. It seemed to adapt to each victim's unique biology, which made it impossible to create a universal treatment. Kevin nodded slowly as he processed this information. He was beginning to form a theory, but he needed more data before he could be sure. He asked Silvera if he could observe the gliders from a safe distance. He wanted to watch them in their natural habitat and study their behavior patterns. Silvera was hesitant at first. It was not forbidden to observe the gliders, but it was considered unwise. Many of those who watched too closely eventually made the mistake of getting too close. But Kevin promised that he would keep his distance. And eventually, she agreed to take him to an observation platform near the forest edge. That evening, Kevin stood on the platform and watched the gliders move through the canopy. They were even more beautiful up close. Their scales shifted through colors that had no names in any human language. They glided between the crystalline trees with perfect grace, their membrane wings catching the light of the twin moons. They sang to each other in voices that sounded like wind chimes made of glass. Kevin watched them for hours. He noticed things that he suspected no one else had ever bothered to observe. He saw the way they groomed each other with gentle touches. He saw the way they curled together in groups when they slept. He saw the way they played, chasing each other through the branches in what looked like games of tag-dot, and he noticed something else. Something important. Their scales did not glow constantly. There were moments when the iridescent shimmer faded to a softer hue. There were moments when their venom glands seemed to go quiet. He watched more closely, trying to identify what triggered these changes. And slowly, the pattern became clear. When the gliders were calm, their scales were soft and their venom glands were still. When they were stressed or frightened, their scales blazed with color and their glands pulsed with poison. It was a defensive mechanism, triggered not by contact itself, but by the perception of threat. Kevin felt his heart beat faster as the implications became clear. The gliders were not inherently deadly. They were not monsters that killed on touch. They were frightened creatures that lashed out when they sensed danger. And the reason every Thalorian who approached them died was not because the gliders wanted to kill Dot. It was because the Thalorians were afraid. Their fear triggered the defensive response. Their elevated heart rates and stress hormones signaled danger to the gliders, who flooded their scales with venom in response. It was a cycle of fear that had been repeating for 40,000 years. Kevin looked out at the gliding creatures and felt something shift inside him. He was not afraid of them. He had never been afraid of dangerous animals. He had learned long ago that fear was the real killer, not the creatures themselves. And if he was right about what he had just discovered, then everything the Thalorians believed about their most sacred and feared creatures was wrong. He needed to prove it, and he knew exactly how he was going to do it. Kevin waited until the diplomatic dinner was well underway before he slipped away from the guest compound. The ambassador and the other senior members of the delegation were seated at a long table with High Counselor Vetheran and his advisors. They were discussing the finer points of interstellar shipping regulations, and no one noticed when the junior xenobiologist quietly excused himself and disappeared into the night. The twin moons of Valorous 7 hung low in the sky, casting silver light across the crystalline forest. Kevin moved carefully along the path he had memorized during his daylight explorations with Silvera. He knew exactly where he was going. He had been planning this for 3 days, ever since he had made his observations from the platform. The forest was alive with strange sounds. Insects that looked like floating jewels hummed through the air around him. Small creatures scurried through the underbrush, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. The crystalline trees caught the light and scattered it in patterns that seemed almost magical. It was one of the most beautiful places Kevin had ever seen. He walked for nearly an hour before he reached the clearing he had chosen. It was a small open space surrounded by tall trees, with a fallen log at its center that would make a perfect seat. The canopy above was thick with glider nests, and Kevin could hear their wind-chime voices drifting down through the branches. He sat down on the log and made himself comfortable. Then he closed his eyes and focused on his breathing. Slow and steady. In through the nose, out through the mouth. He let the tension drain from his muscles. He let the thoughts drain from his mind. He imagined himself as part of the forest, as natural and unthreatening as the crystalline trees themselves. His grandmother had taught him this technique when he was just a boy on their farm in Nebraska. She had grown up in a time when venomous snakes were common in the fields, and she had learned that the best way to survive an encounter was to remain calm. Panic attracted predators. Panic triggered attacks. But calmness was invisible. Calmness was safe. Kevin sat in the clearing for nearly 30 minutes before he heard the first rustle of wings. He opened his eyes slowly and saw a venomous glider perched on a branch about 3 meters away. It was watching him with those large obsidian eyes, its scales shimmering softly in the moonlight. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply looked at the creature and let it look at him in return. He kept his breathing slow and his heartbeat steady. He thought peaceful thoughts about green fields and quiet rivers and the smell of rain on summer grass. The glider tilted its head to one side, studying him with obvious curiosity. Its scales were not blazing with color. Its venom glands were not pulsing. It seemed confused by this strange creature that sat so still and radiated no fear. After a few more minutes, the glider spread its wings and glided down from the branch. It landed on the far end of the fallen log, just a few feet away from Kevin. This close, he could see the intricate patterns on its scales. He could see the delicate structure of its membrane wings. He could see the intelligence in its eyes. Kevin slowly extended his hand, but not toward the glider. He held it out to the side, palm up, fingers relaxed. It was a gesture of openness, an invitation rather than a demand. He had used this technique with countless dangerous animals on Earth and beyond. It showed that he had no weapons. It showed that he meant no harm. The glider watched his hand for a long moment. Then it made a soft sound, something like a question spoken in wind chimes. It hopped a few inches closer along the log. Then a few inches more. Kevin remained perfectly still. His heart was beating faster now, but he controlled it with the discipline of years of practice. He thought about calm waters. He thought about gentle breezes. He thought about everything peaceful and safe that he had ever known. The glider reached his hand. It sniffed at his fingers with a small nose that Kevin had not noticed before. It seemed to be analyzing his scent, trying to understand what kind of creature he was. Then, so gently that he almost did not feel it, it pressed its head against his open palm. The scales were cool to the touch. They felt like smooth glass beneath his fingertips. And they were not secreting venom. There was no burning, no pain, no rush of poison into his bloodstream. There was only the soft pressure of an alien creature seeking contact with another living being. Kevin let out a slow breath. His theory had been correct. The gliders were not inherently deadly. They only became deadly when they sensed fear. And because he was not afraid, they had no reason to defend themselves. He began to stroke the glider's head gently, running his fingers along the smooth scales behind its ears. The creature made a sound of pure contentment, something like a cat's purr mixed with the ringing of tiny bells. Its eyes half closed with pleasure, and it pressed more firmly against his hand. Another rustle of wings drew Kevin's attention upward. A second glider was descending from the canopy. This one was slightly larger than the first, with scales that shimmered between deep blue and brilliant purple. It landed on the log beside the first glider and studied Kevin with the same curious expression. Kevin extended his other hand toward the newcomer. It approached with less hesitation than the first one had shown. It seemed to understand that this strange creature was safe, that it could be trusted. Within minutes, the second glider was pressing against his palm, just like the first. A third glider appeared soon after. This one landed directly on Kevin's shoulder, its small claws gripping the fabric of his jacket. It nuzzled against his ear and made that wind chime sound of happiness. Kevin sat in the moonlit clearing with 3 venomous gliders surrounding him. One in his lap, one pressing against his hand, one perched on his shoulder. Their scales were cool and smooth against his skin. Their voices filled the air with gentle music, and not a single drop of venom touched his body. He thought about the 40,000 years of fear that had kept the Thalorians away from these creatures. He thought about all the monuments in the gardens of eternal warning. He thought about all the deaths that could have been prevented if someone had just taken the time to understand that the gliders were not monsters. They were lonely creatures who had been isolated from warm contact for longer than human civilization had existed. They craved connection just like any other social species. But every time a Thalorian approached them, the fear triggered their defense, which reinforced the fear, which made the next approach even more dangerous. It was a tragedy built on misunderstanding. And Kevin had just proven that it did not have to be this way. He did not know how long he sat there with the gliders. Time seemed to lose meaning in that peaceful clearing. But eventually, he heard footsteps on the path behind him, and he turned to see Silvera standing at the edge of the trees. Her eyes were wide with shock. Her mouth was open, but no words came out. She was staring at the three deadly creatures that surrounded this strange human who had done the impossible. Kevin smiled at her. He raised one hand in a gentle wave, careful not to disturb the glider that was curled contentedly in his lap. And then Silvera found her voice. Silvera stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, with her four-fingered hands pressed against her mouth. Her large eyes were fixed on the impossible sight before her. A human was sitting on a fallen log with three venomous gliders surrounding him. One was curled in his lap like a pet. One was pressed against his hand like it was begging for attention. One was perched on his shoulder and nuzzling against his ear. And the human was smiling. She tried to speak, but only a strangled whisper came out. She had followed Kevin when she noticed him leaving the diplomatic dinner. She had been worried about him wandering into the forest alone at night. She had expected to find him lost or injured or perhaps frightened by some small creature in the underbrush. She had not expected this. Kevin raised one hand slowly and gestured for her to stay calm. He spoke in a low and soothing voice. He told her that everything was okay. He told her that the gliders were not going to hurt him. He told her that they were not going to hurt her either, as long as she remained calm. Silvera did not feel calm. Her heart was pounding so hard that she could feel it in her throat. Her hands were trembling. Her mind was racing through every story she had ever heard about glider attacks. She knew that she should run. She knew that she should call for emergency response. She knew that every second she stood here was another second closer to death. But she did not run. Something in Kevin's voice held her in place. Something in the way he sat so peacefully with those deadly creatures made her hesitate. Kevin began to explain what he had discovered. He spoke slowly and clearly, giving her time to process each word. He told her about his observations from the platform. He told her about the way the gliders' venom glands pulsed when they were stressed but went still when they were calm. He told her about the cycle of fear that had trapped her people for 40,000 years. Silvera listened with growing disbelief. She wanted to argue with him. She wanted to tell him that he was wrong. But she could see the proof sitting right in front of her. 3 venomous gliders were touching this human, and he was not dying. He was not even uncomfortable. He was petting them like they were tame animals. Kevin told her about his grandmother on the farm in Nebraska. He told her about the copperheads and the black widows and all the other dangerous creatures he had grown up around. He told her that his grandmother had taught him that most animals did not want to hurt people. They were just scared. And if you could show them that you were not a threat, they would show you the same courtesy. The glider on Kevin's shoulder lifted its head and looked toward Silvera. Its obsidian eyes seemed to study her with the same curiosity that the first glider had shown toward Kevin. It made a soft wind chime sound that might have been a greeting. Kevin told Silvera to focus on her breathing. He told her to slow her heart rate. He told her to think peaceful thoughts and let the fear drain away from her body. He told her that the gliders could sense her stress hormones, her elevated pulse, her fight-or-flight response. He told her that as long as she was afraid, she was in danger. But if she could find calm, she would be safe. Silvera had been trained in meditation since she was a child. All Thalorians were. It was part of their cultural heritage, a practice passed down through countless generations. She closed her eyes and reached for that training now. She focused on the rhythm of her breath. She let her thoughts grow quiet. She imagined a still pond without a single ripple on its surface. When she opened her eyes, the glider on Kevin's shoulder had spread its wings. It glided across the clearing, and landed on a branch just a few feet from where she stood. Its scales were shimmering softly in the moonlight, but they were not blazing with defensive color. Its venom glands were still. Silvera stood perfectly motionless as the creature studied her. She kept her breathing slow and steady. She kept her thoughts peaceful. She did not let herself think about all the ways this could go wrong. The glider hopped closer along the branch. It tilted its head to one side and made that questioning wind chime sound. It seemed to be asking her something. Perhaps it was asking if she was a friend. Silvera raised one trembling hand, palm up, fingers relaxed, just as she had watched Kevin do. The glider leaned forward and sniffed at her fingers. It seemed to be analyzing her scent, trying to understand what she was and whether she could be trusted. And then, impossibly, it pressed its head against her palm. The scales were cool and smooth, like polished glass. There was no burning. There was no pain. There was only the gentle pressure of a creature seeking connection with another living being. Silvera felt tears begin to stream down her face. 40,000 years of fear dissolved in that single moment of contact. Everything she had been taught about these creatures was wrong. Everything her people believed was based on a terrible misunderstanding. Kevin rose slowly from the log, careful not to disturb the gliders that were still touching him. He walked over to stand beside Silvera and watched as she gently stroked the creature that had trusted her with its touch. He told her that this was just the beginning. He told her that if one Thalorian could do this, then others could learn as well. He told her that the gliders had been waiting for this moment for longer than either of their species could comprehend. They had been lonely for 40,000 years, and now they finally had a chance to end that loneliness. Silvera looked at Kevin with wonder in her eyes. She asked him how he had known, how he had been so certain that his theory was correct, how he had found the courage to test it when the consequences of failure would have been death. Kevin smiled and shrugged his shoulders. He told her that he had not been certain at all. He told her that he had just been willing to take a chance. He told her that sometimes the only way to break a cycle of fear was to be the first one, brave enough to stop being afraid. The gliders stayed with them for nearly an hour. They glided between Kevin and Silvera, seeking pets and attention like affectionate cats. They sang their wind chime songs and pressed their cool scales against warm hands. They showed no aggression, no defensiveness, no trace of the deadly reputation that had defined them for millennia. Eventually, the creatures returned to their nests in the canopy, and Kevin and Silvera began the long walk back to the guest compound. They walked in silence for most of the journey, both of them lost in thought about what had just happened and what it might mean for the future. When they reached the edge of the compound, Silvera stopped and turned to face Kevin. She told him that she needed to inform High Counselor Vetheran about what had occurred. She told him that the council would want to see proof of his discovery. She told him that everything was about to change. Kevin nodded slowly. He had known this moment would come. He had known that his private experiment in the forest would become something much larger. He was not sure he was ready for what came next, but he knew there was no turning back now. He had touched the untouchable. He had survived the unsurvivable. And he had shown an ancient civilization that their greatest fear was based on nothing but a misunderstanding that had lasted longer than human civilization itself. The question now was what they would do with that knowledge. The Grand Council Chamber of Velethanar was the largest enclosed space Kevin had ever seen. It was a vast dome of living architecture, its walls pulsing with soft bioluminescent light. Hundreds of Thalorians sat in tiered rows that rose toward the curved ceiling, their violet robes creating a sea of color that stretched in every direction. At the center of the chamber stood a raised platform where High Counselor Vetheran and his 12 senior advisors sat in judgment. Kevin stood before them with Ambassador Crawford at his side. The ambassador had not slept since Silvera had delivered her report in the middle of the night. She had spent hours questioning Kevin about what he had done and why he had done it. She had been angry at first, furious that he had risked his life and potentially endangered the entire diplomatic mission. But when she had seen the recordings from Silvera's observation device, her anger had transformed into something else entirely. Now she stood beside him in the chamber, ready to defend him if necessary. But she suspected that defense would not be needed. The expressions on the Thalorian faces around them were not hostile. They were confused and curious, and perhaps even hopeful. Vetheran rose from his seat and addressed the assembly. He spoke in the formal register of High Thalorian, which the translation devices converted to English for the human delegates. He explained that a human had violated one of their oldest laws. A human had approached the Venomous gliders and touched them. A human had done what no Thalorian had done in 40,000 years. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some of the counselors leaned forward with interest. Others leaned back with expressions of concern. All of them were staring at Kevin with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. Vetheran continued. He said that this human should be dead. He said that every precedent in their history indicated that contact with a glider was fatal. He said that the young scientist Silvera had witnessed the encounter and had provided recordings that confirmed what should have been impossible. He turned to face Kevin directly. He asked the human to explain himself. He asked how this impossible thing had happened. Kevin took a deep breath and stepped forward. He was not a public speaker. He was not comfortable addressing crowds, but he had spent his entire career learning to remain calm in the face of danger. And this was just another form of danger that required the same response. He began by telling them about Earth. He told them about the wolves that humans had once feared and hunted to near extinction, only to later realize that the wolves were essential to healthy ecosystems. He told them about the sharks that humans had demonized for centuries, only to discover that these creatures almost never attacked people unless provoked. He told them about the snakes and spiders and scorpions that humans had learned to live alongside once they understood their behavior. He told them that fear was natural. Fear was a survival instinct that had protected their species for millions of years. But fear could also become a prison. Fear could blind them to truths that were hiding in plain sight. Fear could perpetuate cycles of misunderstanding that lasted longer than civilization's thought. Then he explained what he had discovered about the gliders. He told them about the venom glands that only activated when the creatures felt threatened. He told them about the stress hormones and elevated heart rates that signaled danger to the glider's sensitive senses. He told them that their ancestors had approached these creatures with fear, and that fear had triggered the defensive response, which had reinforced the fear, which had made the next encounter even more deadly. He told them that he had approached the gliders without fear. He had sat in the clearing with a calm heart and peaceful thoughts. He had extended his hand as an invitation rather than a threat, and the gliders had responded to his calmness with trust. The chamber was silent as he spoke. Hundreds of Thalorians listened to every word with an intensity that bordered on desperation. They wanted to believe him. He could see it in their faces. They wanted to believe that their greatest fear was based on mistake. One of the senior advisors stood and asked a sharp question. She wanted to know if Kevin was suggesting that 40,000 years of Thalorian wisdom was wrong. She wanted to know if he believed that their ancestors were fools who could not understand the creatures of their own world. Kevin shook his head. He said that their ancestors were not fools. They were simply caught in a trap that they could not see from the inside. Each generation had inherited the fear of the previous generation. Each generation had passed that fear to the next. No single individual was to blame. It was a collective tragedy that had grown too large for any one person to recognize. He told them that humans had fallen into the same. traps many times throughout their history. They had feared and hated each other based on skin color, nationality, religion, and countless other differences. They had only broken free from those cycles when brave individuals were willing to be the first to stop being afraid. Another advisor stood and asked a practical question. He wanted to know if Thalorians could learn to approach the gliders as Kevin had done. He wanted to know if it was possible for his people to end 40,000 years of isolation from their most sacred creatures. Kevin nodded. He pointed to Silvera, who was standing near the edge of the chamber. He told the council that Silvera had already done it. She had touched a glider less than 12 hours ago. She had used the meditation techniques that were part of Thalorian heritage to calm her mind and slow her heart. She had proven that his discovery was not limited to humans. All eyes turned to Silvera. She stood straight and tall under the weight of their attention. She confirmed everything Kevin had said. She described the moment when the glider had pressed its head against her palm. She described the cool smoothness of its scales and the gentle sound of its wind chime voice. She described the overwhelming emotion that had washed over her when she realized that everything she had been taught was wrong. Vetheran was silent for a long moment. Then he rose from his seat and descended from the dais. He walked across the chamber floor until he stood directly in front of Kevin. His ancient eyes searched the human's face, looking for something that only he could see. He spoke in a soft voice that carried throughout the silent chamber. He said that humans continued to surprise them. He said that they had expected human technology and human ambition. They had not expected human courage. They had not expected a species brave enough to reach out its hand to the untouchable and prove that touch was possible. He placed one of his four-fingered hands on Kevin's shoulder. He said that this human had given his people a gift more valuable than any trade agreement. He had given them the chance to reclaim something they had lost 40,000 years ago. Ambassador Crawford stepped forward and spoke for the first time since the session began. She said that humans were strange creatures. She said that they petted things. It was simply what they did. They found dangerous animals, and they figured out how to make friends with them. It was written into their DNA. The chamber erupted in a sound that might have been laughter. Or perhaps it was relief. After 40,000 years of fear, the Thalorians had finally been shown a way out. In the months that followed, Kevin and Silvera worked together to develop a training program for glider interaction. They taught meditation techniques and breathing exercises. They explained the science of stress hormones and defensive triggers. They guided dozens of Thalorians through their first encounters with the creatures their ancestors had feared for millennia. The first Thalorian to successfully pet a glider on their own was an elderly woman who had lost her daughter to a glider attack 300 years ago. When she felt those cool scales beneath her fingers and heard that wind chime song of contentment, she wept with a joy that could not be expressed in any language. The treaty between humanity and the Thalorian collective was signed 3 months after the Grand Council session. It included provisions for trade, cultural exchange, and mutual defense. But the most important clause was one that no one had expected. It designated humans as official consultants to the Thalorian glider integration program. It acknowledged that sometimes the best way to understand something was to look at it through the eyes of a stranger. Kevin stood on the observation platform on his last night on Velarus 7. 3 gliders had come to say goodbye. They curled around him and sang their wind chime songs and pressed their cool scales against his warm hands. He thought about the warning he had heard on his first day on this world. Never touch a venomous glider. He thought about all the warnings he had ignored throughout his life. He thought about how often those warnings had been based on nothing but fear. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing was not the monster in the darkness. Sometimes it was the fear in your own heart. And sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply reach out your hand.